shared the article with me about autistic burnout, and I want you to talk about autistic burnout in relation to what what almost everyone talks about, regression.
Yeah.
Okay, and even in relation to the data we're taking on, so much data on these kids. I mean, if you're in speech therapy, if you're in school, if you have an IEP, I mean, we're taking all of this data on these kids. And, sometimes they're, moving up, the web and flow of our autistic kids, sometimes they're moving up and they're in a great place. And then sometimes they just regress.
Drop off a cliff.
Okay? And so that's what they call it. They're talking about regressing.
Yeah.
And I want you to talk about that, all of that.
Okay.
And go.
And go. Well, we touched on it a little bit earlier about like when we're talking about neurology and we're talking about taking in all this information about working harder. So if you imagine it as kind of like a 100-yard dash, so an autistic person starts on the start line, but non-autistic people are already 50 yards into the 100-yard dash. So they've got a head start on everything. So we're working, but the expectation is always there that we've started in the same place. Even though people know that we're not, even though they know that we move through developmental milestones at different rates and at different times and all those things, it's all very different. They kind of know all that, but screw it all up and chuck it out the window and still have the expectation that we should do what everybody else does. So because we're working harder at doing all of this, and because also at the same time, we're having to mask, we're having to fit in. Masking is like a whole different conversation, but this is what leads to burnout kind of thing. It's literally all the things that you do for an autistic person does to fit in. So it's running scripts constantly and editing scripts constantly, suppressing sensory, reactions to sensory information, negative reactions to sensory information, holding yourself. Yeah. Holding yourself in physically, speaking when you can't speak or forcing yourself through that, not regulating meltdowns. And on a day-to-day basis, as that happens, I give the example in that article that I used to come home from work and literally would come in, get in at 4 o'clock and would collapse in a heap and would get up at like 9 o'clock at night kind of thing. So it would just be unconscious for that whole time. So I was not regulating myself properly because I was having to go through that every single day. And it gets to a point where that becomes unsustainable. Your body just can't hack it anymore. And what happens then, you enter into a period of what I term extreme burnout, where it looks like clinical depression. It has the physical representation of clinical depression. It's like you feel like you're moving through treacle, you can't get out of bed, even down to things like your peripheral vision narrows, you dissociate more, all of these kind of different things that you would expect with depression. But there's one significant difference in that you're not sad. You're unhappy because you don't know what's happening to you and you wish that you could get out of it and you become frustrated at that, but you are not clinically depressed. But when professionals are looking at this, because you are showing all the physical signs of it, and because you're usually, you're handed your 10-point "Are you depressed?" checklist where you can only score things kind of thing, and because you are still at that point trying really hard to mask and conform, and because there's no other answer to what you're going through, you fill in the depression checklist as though you are depressed, and you give them the answers you think they want to know. Then you get described antidepressants, you get CBT, you get talking therapy. If you're lucky enough to get those things, and and you're being medicated for something that medication is not going to help with, then you reach a point where you start realizing that the medication isn't doing anything for you, but you are still going through this process. So then you start turning inwardly on yourself and you start thinking, well, if the medication isn't working, this is me that's the problem. This is the issue here. And then
that's even worse.
Exactly. And you kind of, that's the internalized ableism starts coming in and all this kind of self-hatred. It does. It's a complete downward spiral. And then you do actually start getting into the realms of clinical depression because you have literally depressed yourself. It's flippant, but it's effectively kind of what happens. And in amongst all that, because you are, you're worn out, you're physically and emotionally and psychologically worn out, your body starts having autoimmune reactions to things. And that's why lots of autistic people have, like physical, we get eczema and all of the kind of the aches and pains that go with everything, and you know, all of those kind of things. And quite often it's stuff that you get investigated for, but nobody can ever find the source of these things. There's no label attached to it, or it's something like, you know, like IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, which isn't really a thing. It's caused by stress and all these other things that are going on. And you know, if you think about, and then in terms of regression, if you are masking furiously and you are able to do the things that other people can do, or at least from the outside perspective, look like you're able to do all those things. Right. And then all of a sudden you hit this period of burnout where you can't do these things anymore and the mask drops off. It's going to look like you've let back 3 years in your developmental abilities, or, you know, all of a sudden you used to be absolutely cognitively, you used to be brilliant, and now all of a sudden cognitively you're not brilliant because you're full of brain fog and all of these different things that start happening. From an outside perspective, it looks like what will be termed regression. Now, if you think about, you know, I don't want to talk about Andy Wakefield and vaccines and things like that, but if you think about the MMR jab, and at the age that the MMR jab happens, it's around the time that an autistic child really starts socializing properly for the first time. So you think you have a child that's so you have a child that's taken from a safe, fairly isolated space. You know, they might have friends and family around a lot, but you know, that's pretty much it. And then all of a sudden you dump them in a nursery full of strangers, with loads of different sensory information going on, and their ability to kind of mask everything that's gone through is now nil. Then it's going to look like they've regressed, which is what happens at the same, you know, and then at that point you stick a vaccination needle in and the reaction happens at the same time. Coincidentally, it looks like the vaccine
itself to get to get shots and
exactly. So then and the shots themselves are traumatic, right. And you know, and lots of people do have a negative reaction to shots. You know, you can become a little bit ill afterwards and things, which then disallows you to mask at your full capacity and all of those different things. So a child going through this without any understanding or an explanation of what's going to happen, it's going to look like someone stuck a needle in them and then they've turned into a severely autistic person, which isn't actually the case. There's this whole context that's missing around it. And this happens through whole periods of life. And now there is research that's gone on in the UK that actually identifies autistic masking as a lead into the high suicide rates amongst autistic adults. So it's actually now not proven, but it's something that's really now being investigated as an indicator of later suicide.
Who is investigating?
Sorry?
Who is?
It's a lady called Sarah Cassidy at Nottingham University in the UK. If you can't get hold of it, I'll get the research for you and send it over to you. And now other people are now doing work off the back of that. And there's lots of work in the UK. There's lots of research going on in the UK about masking, and there's lots of narratives being created which I'm not comfortable with, that are kind of, you know, especially separating autistic women and girls from the rest of the autistic population. There's whole issues around that. We're not going into that now, but it's kind of, there is work happening here, but around burnout, there is autistic burnout specifically, there is no research. The only piece of research that's happened, and it came off the back of me actually writing that article, was Aspire, which is Dora Raymaker and Christina Nicolaides. They did a qualitative piece of research, which it was actually named after a line from that article. And so they're going to do more work into that. I can send you, they've done some presentations on it, so I can send you the links for those. Yeah. But that's it. There's no other research. This is something the autistic community have been talking about for like 25 years, and there's no research into any of this. And it's kind of, this is so frustrating, absolutely frustrating, because the research world is constantly behind the autistic community.
Right. They have their own agendas.
And the research that happens is very, you know, it's very shaped by narratives and who's funding it and all of those things. And so it's like this constant. It's like
this. Yeah.
Say that again.
Who is going to make money off of it?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
And at the minute, because there's no tangible way of making money out of autistic burnout and autistic masking, there's no money being pumped into that kind of research.
Right.
It's just a mess.
You're describing my life in an extreme burnout right now. I'm sorry. Diagnosed at 40 a few months ago. It's so hard to explain to people around me. Thanks for such a great explanation. You talk about that as well, like, or maybe it may have been Emma that talked about after a person receives their diagnosis, especially as an adult, they go through this period of, I guess, allowing themselves to take the mask off and really feeling that burnout. I mean, just really, I mean, it's traumatizing in a way that, yes, it's wonderful that you know what's happening, but then you kind of are reliving all of these traumatic things.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's that period, especially in a late diagnosed adult, it's a huge issue, because usually someone's got to the age of kind of, I don't know, like mid-30s, 40s, even later. I had someone email the other day who was 87 and had just been diagnosed.
Wow.
And this was all, I mean, she was so uber positive that all these questions have been answered, kind of thing, after all this time. But, it's kind of, when someone gets that diagnosis at that late stage, it's usually burnout that's led to them getting that diagnosis, because there's no other answer. So they start searching for random things that might actually answer those questions, and then they generally stumble across someone who's autistic that's written something, and it kind of makes sense. But
goes off, yeah.
But there's when that happens, when that mask comes off, when someone's been masking for so long, there's massive identity issues there as well, because it's literally kind of people. I've had people come to me saying, I can't stop masking because I'm terrified that there's nothing underneath. How painful is that they're actually terrified of their true selves, and because they don't know how to be any different, and
or even how to find it. Yeah,
exactly. And it's just awful. I mean, in the blog, I mean, for people that are making comments about kind of that they're going through it, it's in the blog, I've got some suggestions of different things that people can do to kind of help them through it. But the biggest things are really kind of limiting anything that causes you sensory upset, is limiting that as much as possible, is reducing the amount of demands on yourself and the amount of demands that other people place on you, and basically withdrawing for a long time and doing what you need to do in order to kind of get through it. Exactly. But the difficulty there is that lots of these people are parents, have jobs, need the money that's coming in, so you just have to kind of pick your way through it. It's really hard for me to say this, because I wish I had a tangible answer for everybody, but you have to find your own path through this using as many of the different techniques as possible.
And as a parent, if you're a parent of a child who's autistic, it's important to and you said this, and I'm only quoting you, I'm not giving my own advice here, but it's important to look at your child and recognize the signs of overstimulation, and maybe when somebody says, oh, well, they're regressing, or we took this data on your child and he's hit a regressive, or maybe that is having bad behavior, defiance, and instead looking at what's happening, maybe taking a step back, maybe keeping them home from school, or just thinking about your child in terms of that type of overstimulation in regards to that burnout, so that those kind of things don't happen. Taking care of your child.
And that's the thing. I mean, I don't know if it's in that article, but it's a line I use quite a lot. If you think, as an adult, if an adult who has a job as a teacher, social workers, anybody in that kind of the helpful kind of services, if you are run down and if you are unhappy in your workplace, you can go to your doctors and you can get a medical sign off to say, you're going to be off work for 3 months or whatever, however long it is that you need. Children are dragged to school kicking and screaming. Children who are going through exactly the same experience are physically picked up and carried and dragged into places. School is an awful environment. School causes most burnout in most autistic children, because of the education system and how restrictive and narrow it is, because of the sensory overstimulation, because you are in an environment where you are having to mask furiously, where you don't understand the communication that's going on around you. All of these things, of course, that's going to trigger you into a burnout. How could it not? But then you're dragged there and you're dragged there. And then parents who kind of stand up and say, no, I'm not going to do this anymore, then they get parent blame and all of these kind of processes kick into place. So again, it's a really, really difficult thing to navigate. But, I'm with my oldest son. I've got 3 children. 2 of them are diagnosed. My oldest one in particular, he does school 4.5 days a week. So he has Friday afternoon off. We take him to a dog cafe where he goes and plays with the dogs and helps out serving tables and things like that, you know, because he loved that. It's an environment that he loves to be in, kind of thing. And it's so there's more valuable education in him doing that than there is forcing him to stay in a building that he can't cope in.
And all of this is, I mean, I have 2 older kids who are neurotypical, if that's even a possibility for a teenager to be. But I mean, I put this in context of raising them as well. I mean, we take days off of school. Like if it's 80 degrees and it's March, we take the day off and we go to the beach.
Yeah.
Because it's not just, I mean, it's the school world, the world of, you know, the world of school, the world around us is overwhelming for everyone. Yeah. I mean, you've got, you know, my teenagers who are, you know, they do well in school. They don't really have any sensory issues. They're social. They get burned out. And just to think of how burned out my autistic kids are dealing with all of that. I mean, it's important to take time and just decompress for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. Everybody needs that.